Introduce the speaker, Dr. Carter. He's a senior scientist with Creation Ministries International in Atlanta, Georgia. And he spends half his time traveling and speaking at different locations around the U.S. and Canada. He's been with CMI for 14 years now, and his expertise in genetics, as you'll see. He's got a doctorate in marine biology, and he's going to talk tonight on ancient DNA and the Bible. How does that relate to the Bible? How does that relate to Adam and Eve? How does that relate to the flood and the dispersion of nations? And he's going to explain how his talk tonight relates to the other two talks on this related matter. So, Rob, come on up. Let's welcome Rob.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out, especially. I love it when I see an audience full of people.
Sign-up sheet around, too. If you're not on our mailing list yet and want to be informed of upcoming meetings, the clipboards are going around.
I'm going to present to you tonight something I've never presented in public before. I've been working like a dog getting ready for this. This is a field that is exploding in front of us. It literally did not exist until the year 2007. And all of a sudden, we have all this information on DNA in bones from a very long time ago. Now, has this information challenged the Bible? That's what we're going to ask. Does it support the Bible? We'll ask that also. Just a little bit about myself, though. I work for Creation Ministries International at our U.S. offices near Atlanta. I've been doing this for nearly 15 years now, and there's about 30 of me around the world in 7 different offices. And we visit about 1,300 different churches around the world every year. So we're all about getting information out, and we do it in a lot of different ways. You saw my pile of books and DVDs and Creation Magazine on table out there. We also have a gigantic website called creation.com. We're over 14,000 articles now, 42 years of accumulated wisdom. So please go there when we're done. We have tons of stuff ready for you. We also have a weekly email newsletter we put out. I know a lot of you here get that. Thank you so much. But if you'd like to sign up for our weekly newsletter, we're going to pass around a sign-up form while I'm speaking. And when it comes by, you can easily, if you like, put your name down. If not, no big deal, but just pass it to the person next to you because they might not get it yet. That's what the form looks like. And that's going to go around now. Thank you, sir. All right, let me start my talk. How many of you have heard of something in the Bible called the Table of Nations? Good. This is Genesis chapter 10. It describes the nations spreading out after the Tower of Babel on the earth. In that section, there are 16 grandsons of Noah named. Have you heard that before? There's an issue with what I just said, and that is that a lot of the names end in I-M. Kazluhim is not a name. Im in Hebrew is plural. Like Elohim, that's a plural noun. Well, Kazluhim and other Ims in there are plural, so it's not describing the name of a person, but the name of a group. And if you think about the Table of Nations, when was it written? Well, it was written in early post-flood history while the people were still spreading out. Also, if you look at a map of where the nations are, it only goes out to about a couple hundred miles away from Israel. That's it. How many of you have heard of something like this? The sons of... don't raise your hands because I'm going to contradict this. I don't want to embarrass anybody. But a lot of people believe, just reading the Bible really quickly, the sons of Ham went to Africa, the sons of Japheth went to Europe, and Shem stayed in the Middle East and went to Asia. All right. This is not true. That is not what the Bible says. But it's easy. It's like a shorthand version of what the Bible says. In fact, if you look at where the people landed, in green are the sons or the descendants of Ham. In green. Let's see. Let me turn on my little laser pointer here. Here we go. Ham. That's 3 continents. And the Hamites, the Kazluhim, settled Crete. The largest island in the eastern Mediterranean, which we would pretty much call European. Oh. And then we have the sons of Japheth. Yeah, they settled this area, which is, if you go north of here, you're in Asia, but they also settled the islands in the Mediterranean also. In fact, some of the Hamites are down here in Arabia. And then you have got the sons of Shem, from which the Israelites descend. Something else, though. You cannot tell what Y chromosome a person is carrying or what mitochondria a person is carrying when they show up in a place. You can't look at them and say, oh, you're a descendant of Shem. It doesn't work like that. So there's nothing preventing these people from exchanging genes, shall we say. In fact, you kind of expect it, because anytime you have people, someone is going to another city and selling stuff. And what happens? He picks up a girlfriend, not a girlfriend, and babies get exchanged. Genes diffuse across landscapes. They don't stay in one place. So looking at this picture, let me show you a map of where my Y chromosome is found in the world. My Y chromosome, which in the past I would have assumed was from Japheth, is shared with 80% of other men from Western Europe. And a significant number of people living south of the Sahara Desert, south of Lake Chad, in the middle of Cameroon. That is not described in the table of Genesis. Is this a contradiction to the Bible? No, not at all. This is something that happened thousands of years after the Table of Nations was written. See, here's the other thing. It was written at one point in time, and people move. People migrate. There are wars or invasions. Things change. It was written. It's true. It's real history. And then after that, everything gets scrambled. So if we just take a step back and think about human behavior in history, we should not expect the Table of Nations to directly be reflected in the modern human gene pool. It sort of should be there, but plus all these years of scrambling. Okay, I think I just changed some people's mind in this room, and I'm glad. So ancient DNA is not necessarily going to contradict the Bible, but it doesn't mean also that we're going to prove the Bible, because history is chaotic. Now, interestingly, my Irish great-great-great-grandfather came over from Donegal County in the Middle Irish potato famine. And he had this Y chromosome family. But there are other people in Ireland that belong to a completely different branch on the human family tree. So I could be more closely related to a man from Central Africa with the darkest possible skin than my Irish great-great-great-grandfather's next-door neighbor. And we ask the question, what is a race at that point? Okay, we're going to be talking about ancient DNA. We have to find a timeline to explain all of this. Here's a generalized Bible timeline. I rounded off everything to the nearest 500 to make it really easy to remember. Creation, a little bit more than 4,000 years ago. 4,000 BC, I should say. The flood's about 1,500 years later. Abraham lives about 2,000 BC. Moses is about 1,500 BC. David is about 1,000 BC. Jesus, of course, at 0. And we're alive today 2,000 years after Jesus. That's a nice conceptual framework. I remember growing up, I had no concept of any of these things. I didn't know where anything was in the Bible. I had vague stories in my mind about a couple of people, but I couldn't have told you anything about the history. Just because I wasn't putting it together. So I put this together. I like that. Well, where is this in the archaeological record? Have you ever heard of the Iron Age or the Bronze Age? Where were they and how long were they? Interesting. Actually, we would call Moses a Bronze Age individual. David is not. David lives in Iron Age 2. These ages are only a couple hundred years long. Why? Because technology was developing very quickly. Bronze was amazing, but had nothing once they invented iron. But also, there's other things in history. You've heard of the fall of Troy, right, and the Trojan Wars? Well, Homer is pretty much mythological because there's not a Scylla and Charybdis and there's not a Cyclops and things like that. No, that's not there. Well, plus, it looks like the fall of Troy happened at about 1020 BC. That's when King David was alive. Oh, have you heard of the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta? Yeah, 400 BC. I don't remember which came first. I think it's afterwards. You know the story of Queen Esther, right? Right? She gets married to the king of Persia, right? He's the guy who invaded Greece. Have you heard of the Battle of Thermopylae? And the 300 Spartans? While at the same time the Athenian army is destroying the Persian navy, the Spartans are dying to the man. Yeah, that's only a couple hundred years BC. It's after the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. Cool. I love history, by the way. I'm a geneticist, right? But you know what I found in science? I found a science that's the science of history. I had a hard time choosing between history and biology. Even in grad school, I was like, all right, I've got a degree in biology. I'll keep going. But I'm always looking at the history. And you know what? All I read is history books. I do read a couple science books sometimes, but I am a history geek. And so I get to put these things together in this talk, finally. All right. If you would like more information on how old the earth is according to Scripture, may I point you to an article I wrote with a co-author, a friend of mine, The Biblical Minimum and Maximum Age of the Earth. If you go to creation.com, type in minimum, maximum, it'll come right up. What we did is we looked at all the passages in Scripture that we could find that had something to do with the age of the earth, and we said, okay, what's our range of possibilities? For instance, when Adam had Seth, Adam was 130 years old. But Seth wasn't born on Adam's birthday. It was somewhere in that year. So it's on average adding 6 months every time we have one of those statements. So when Bishop Ussher said creation was in 4004 BC, you can't know that. You have to add 6 months plus or minus for every one of those 20 generations between Adam and Abraham. You got a 5-year window just like that. And there's more. There's a lot more. But our range was just a couple of hundred years. And that's as worse as we could possibly get it. So creation is about 4200-ish BC. That's what I like to say. You okay with that? Okay. Now, we have to take all the evolutionary numbers I'm about to share with you and shove them into that timeline. Yuck. But I'm going to tell you that most of the dates are based on carbon dating. And carbon dating depends upon the Earth's magnetic field and the number of sunspots. We know the sun varies over time, which is why you can't just take something and carbon date it and know how old it is. You have to have a model of the atmosphere at that time. Also, the Earth's magnetic field has been exponentially decreasing since we discovered that the Earth has a magnetic field. The stronger the magnetic field is, the more it protects us from the positively charged cosmic rays that are coming in from outer space that make carbon-14. So in the past, things should have had less carbon-14. And we measure an old thing today, it only has a little bit of carbon-14, so it looks older than it really is. And if we account for the carbon-14 dates, all of ancient history should accordion into the modern time frame, but most of the change happens the earlier you get. So by the time you get to King David, it's pretty close. When you're at the time of Jericho, you're about 200 years off. In fact, the ash layer at Jericho dates 200 years prior to when the Bible says it was destroyed. So Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s, right after carbon dating was invented, she said, I see no evidence for the destruction of Joshua here, because her ash layer was 200 years prior. Okay. Now let's get into ancient DNA. This started in 1984 when some crazy scientist, and crazy because this isn't supposed to be true, DNA is supposed to break down very rapidly. He said, I wonder if that museum display of this quagga has any DNA in it. It died in 1883. That's literally 99 years, actually 101 years afterwards. He samples it. And it has DNA. And they looked at it and they figured out how it's related to a zebra and a horse. And so they essentially resurrected an extinct species. That's amazingly cool. In the 1990s, there were some claims of dinosaur DNA that had been sequenced, and it turned out to be a contaminant. Apparently, someone's eating a ham sandwich in the lab that day. And it was embarrassing, and no one wanted to touch ancient DNA. It wasn't until 2007 when David Reich, now the most famous ancient DNA guy in the world, he was a graduate student, and his supervisor said, hey, see if those Neanderthal bones have any DNA in them. And he didn't think they would. And they did. And that changed everything. That was 2007. We now have dozens of Neanderthal genomes completed. The first one I didn't trust. But then they did a whole bunch more and they kept getting the same thing. It's like, okay, that's Neanderthal DNA. We've also done ancient horses, cave bears, mammoth, mastodons. In fact, interestingly, the Irish cave bears are the progenitors of polar bears. Polar bears that are white used to be cave bears living in Ireland. We can tell all sorts of really crazy things now because in the past, all we had was DNA of living things. Now we look at the DNA of the extinct things. Oh, this connects to that. And you have to rearrange things. It's really cool. We can test a lot of theories of history with this. The world record right now is a horse from Alaska that they claim was 780,000 years old. I'm sorry. Even in a frozen state, DNA cannot last that long. So the dates and the fact there's DNA in these ancient things is actually challenging the evolutionary model. And some people argue, and they fight like crazy, but everyone knows the DNA is there, and so people are kind of like, shh, and they take a sample and they look at it, and then they try not to pronounce the age. But we know how old these things they claim they are. But a lot of ancient bones don't have DNA in them. It's been degraded until someone realized that the petrous bone, the bone that houses your inner ear, is the most dense bone in the body. And it sometimes has 100 times more DNA than the other bones. And now, they're going back to old specimens. They thought they didn't have DNA because they looked at the femur, and there's tons of DNA in the petrous bone. And everything explodes. But we know DNA degrades. What do you think happens to DNA in the ground? It decays really quickly. And there's three main processes. One is cross-linking. These are DNA strands from a liver for an ancient priest in Egypt. Cool. So DNA cross-links. Also, very, very common. We have this thing called cytosine deamination. You know, there's four letters in DNA, right? A, C, G, and T. The C is cytosine. And cytosine has an amine group that reacts with water and it pops off, and now we have a double O. That's uracil. Uracil doesn't belong in DNA. This happens in your bodies all day long, constantly. And your DNA proofreading enzymes are scanning your DNA and say, what's a uracil doing here? And they fix it. But sometimes they read it as a T and say, wait a second, there's a T here. Oh, one of these has to be a C. And they don't know which one. And if they change this one to a C, you just had a T to C mutation. That's the most common mutation in human DNA amongst all of us. It's also the most common chemical reaction that happens in the ground. It's hard to tell them apart. In fact, you can't tell them apart. It's the same chemical reaction. In fact, there's all sorts of other chemical reactions that happen to your DNA. They happen even faster in the dirt. And so when you look at something, you sequence it, ancient DNA has an issue in that you can't trust the sequence. Because chemical reactions happening to DNA, they just get sequenced through, and I don't know what that letter really is. It's probably a G. It might be an A. So ancient DNA has some issues. There's something else that happens. Oh, no, before I say that. There was a famous fossil discovery in South Africa a couple years ago. Homo naledi. They found it in a cave, way back in the cave with a whole bunch of bones, a whole bunch of individuals. And they got these cute, skinny graduate student girls. I'm skinny, I might not be cute, but I'm a caver, I could have done it. But no, they got these cute girls, and it was a big media thing, and they crawled into this way narrow, way deep cave, and they excavated these bones and brought them out, and now we have this thing called Homo naledi, short little human-like thing. And I shook my head, because this is after ancient DNA was discovered. And they didn't excavate these in clean room conditions. They weren't using masks, they weren't wearing gloves. If you touch an ancient bone, you've probably destroyed it for science. Because DNases in your skin will destroy the few little DNA molecules in a bone. And your skin, your cells, there'll be so much more DNA in anything that sloughs off of your body than what's in the bone, you'll never get DNA out of the bone. You can't touch it. You can't sneeze on it. You got to keep it sterile. And they didn't do that. And I'm like, because they could have DNA tested these things. Now, maybe someone will go in and pop a tooth out and drill from underneath the tooth. Or maybe they'll go into the petrous bone. But there's still a very strong chance of contamination because they didn't do it the way they should have. All right, there's another thing about DNA, and that DNA is about the world's worst information storage molecule you can possibly imagine. Why? Because it's fragile. You've got about 1 million of these happening in your cells every day, and your body fixes them all the time. In fact, you have more C to T mutations than breaks, but you have lots of breaks in your cells all the time. DNA in the ground breaks constantly. So between water and oxygen and heat, you don't want that around your DNA. In fact, when they found the Neanderthal DNA, the first Neanderthal that they sequenced, the longest fragment was about 50 letters long. Your chromosome 1 is 250 million letters long. It is 6 inches long, and you have 2 of them. One molecule, 6 inches long. You can't see it because it's so thin, but that's how long it is. And when they found Neanderthal, the biggest piece was 50 letters. In fact, the only way you're able to assemble an ancient genome is if you already have a genome completed. If we didn't have the human genome, they would never have done the Neanderthal. See, what they do is they sequence a whole bunch of DNA at random, if you're doing like a person, randomly sequenced, and then you take the pieces and you look for places where they overlap. And you piece it together like an overlapping puzzle, and then this is an A, C, G, T, T, C, A, and you read down the columns of all your overlap DNA. But you need long pieces of DNA to do that. If you've only got 50 letters or less, what they do is, here, we've got a 15-letter piece here of Neanderthal. That 15-letter sequence is found in the human genome, but only in one place. Stick. Here's another piece. It's got 13 letters. Well, it looks like this over here, but there's an A here and a T here, but every other letter fits. Boop. And they piece it together that way. So you need the human genome as a scaffold. Cool. So how do they do it? How do they get ancient DNA out of these bones? Well, first, they extract the DNA in a sterile room. Highly filtered, everyone's wearing clothes and masks and gloves. Then the first thing they do is they tag it. They have these sets of DNA that just random letters. It's like a barcode. Random letters, and 15 or 20 letters long, just random. And all of the DNA has a random letter set attached to one end. So now they're labeled. Why do they do that? Well, for one reason, later on after you do the sequencing, if there's anything that's not labeled, you know it's a contamination that came from the laboratory. Smart. Real smart. And what they do is they do something called PCR, the polymerase chain reaction, which gave the developer a Nobel Prize. It's one of the most important things in molecular biology is PCR. What you do is you add some polymerases to a solution, A's, G's, and T's, and a little bit of ATP, and you and a little primer, and it's everything. Those things stick to DNA, and they make a copy of it. Then you warm it up, everything falls apart. You cool it off again, and now you have 2 copies of your DNA, and the same thing happens. Now you have 4. You warm it up, everything separates. Cool it down, happens again. Now you have 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. You amplify the number of copies of DNA in your tube. Because ancient DNA, there's not much of it there. You need to amplify it. But the thing is, most of the DNA inside a bone belongs to bacteria and fungi. Maybe a plant root. Maybe some amoebas. Most of the DNA is not from the specimen you're going for. So how do they figure that out? Well, first they sequence the whole thing. They sequence everything. Remember, each one of them has a little tag at the end of it. And so it's okay, number 1003 looks like this, number 5221 looks like this, and they use those letters as a number tag, and they authenticate it like this. If it's a long piece of DNA, they throw it out, because ancient DNA should be fragmented. But also, they look at the ends of the segment, because the C to T, the oxidation things that happen, oh, by the way, when you do PCR, the uracils are assumed to be T's. And all of your uracils, that the deamination reaction to produce a uracil, a T is there. So you have C to T. And now that piece of DNA has a T in it. Well, if you got a whole bunch of places where the human genome says C and this says T, that's a pretty good indication it's ancient DNA. It's been oxidized. And it usually happens at the ends. So now there's some art that comes in. They're going to trim the ends off. But how far do you go? Because there could be a C to T in the middle that's normal, or that came from the body, or that came from the ground. You don't know, but it happens mostly on the ends. So they trim it to some, cut it off, and that's your piece of ancient DNA. This is cool. This should not be true, and that's when they take it all and they hang it up on a genome that already exists. So like when they did the mastodon, they were able to do the mastodon because they already had the elephant. Cave bears because they already had a bear. Neanderthals, because they already had a human. Neanderthals are human. More on that later. But people have done chemical analyses of DNA, and they've looked at the half-life of DNA, how fast it breaks down. Now, on the left here, temperature, 15.5, -5 degrees C. 15 is a nice, cool, rainy day around here. You know, these are just above and just below freezing. So if you had a 30 base pair long piece of DNA, and after about 3,000 years, half of them have been destroyed at 15 C. If you're at freezing temperature, they can last about 158,000 years, and half of them are gone. 100 base pair is less time because 100 base pair is bigger. It's a bigger target for oxidation and things like that. After 10,000 years, this is molecular modeling, by the way. No one's ever been able to do this experiment this long. But they're kind of guessing that after about 10,000 years, at 15 degrees Celsius, you should have pieces no more than 13 letters long. If it's at -5, you might get 683 letters. But that's only 10,000 years. Wait a minute. They're claiming ancient DNA from things that are approaching 1,000,000 years. And they estimate that there will be no DNA left, not even 2 nucleotides stick together. Every single bond has been broken. At the best case, freezing temperatures, 6.8 million years maximum. And there's nothing left. You can't sequence 2 letters, by the way. You need a long piece of DNA. So this is completely unsequenceable way before 6.8 million years. But in 6.8 million years, you might have 2 letters still stuck together. So DNA breaks down really fast. I read this today. I had to stick this in my talk as I'm getting ready to leave. You've heard of Mary Schweitzer, probably. Mary Schweitzer famously found soft tissue in a T-Rex fossil a decade or 2 ago. She then published a paper about protein in a dinosaur fossil, and she published a paper on DNA evidence in a dinosaur fossil. Well, she published another one just now. On top, these are dinosaur. That's a dinosaur bone. It's an emu bone. You know, obviously it's a vertebra. And this is inside the dinosaur bone. This is inside the emu bone. Look, there's just things that look really similar. In other words, the dinosaur bone hasn't completely decayed away. And then she isolates cells from the dinosaur bone, and she stains it with a stain that lights up what looks like a nucleus, and in the emu too. And then another stain that also lights up what looks like a nucleus, and the emu is actually a worse picture than the dinosaur is. It's funny because way back in 2013, she published these pictures. Now on the left, those green dots, that's called DAPI. It's a stain that I've used in the laboratory. It intercalates inside a double helix. So you need a piece of DNA at least like 15 letters long, a little shorter if it has lots of A's and T's in it, but at least 15 or longer, and the DNA sticks in there, and then when you wash it with water, the DNA stays behind, and you hit it with ultraviolet light and it glows green. These are dinosaur cells. But then they stained with another stain for a protein, because some people would have said, oh, well, that might be bacteria. Bacteria have DNA. So they stained it with a stain that stains for histones. Histones are the proteins in your cells that DNA wraps around in your nucleus. Bacteria don't have them. Reptiles do. There's evidence of DNA in dinosaur bones. And a cool thing about this new paper, she's suggesting that it might be time to start trying to sequence dinosaur DNA, which should not be there. Okay. You all right so far? This blowing your minds? All right, let's do some case studies. Let's look at people, because I'm more interested in people than dinosaurs or mammoths. Let's look at people, and let's go in a couple of places around the world and let's just learn what ancient DNA has told us about these people. And let's start with one of the last places on Earth to be settled, North and South America. It is amazing because for a long time, anthropologists were saying, Native Americans kind of look like people in Northeast Asia, and their languages are similar in some ways. Well, the DNA has told us that's true. The DNA of Native Americans is most similar to people living in Northeast Asia today, but the ancient DNA also tells us that. In fact, the most ancient DNA we found for Native Americans in North or South America, first of all, it's clearly related to modern Native Americans. So if you look at the Olmec culture in Central America, their faces are carved, they almost look West African. Yeah, there's no evidence of African DNA. And the stories that I hear about in Georgia and in the Carolinas about this one particular Indian tribe, and the people claim that they're half white people who came over before Columbus. It doesn't look like it's true. Now, there's a lot of political correctness here, and it's difficult. One of the problems is that when they find a piece of European-like DNA in a Native American, they just assume it's post-Columbus. Post-Columbus, you actually don't know that. But also, most of the tribal councils in North America have asked their people to not participate in studies in genetics. Now, there's a lot of bad blood between Native Americans and the American government. We know that, right? And so they said, don't do it. Because one thing they're worried about is being downsized or downregulated. That's not the right word. It's already hard enough for Native Americans to say, I'm Native American. When the government says, oh, no, you're less than 1/4, you're not. See, for them, it's cultural. It's not genetic. And the government's trying to say, oh, no, it's all about biology. But no, it's cultural. So this is why Elizabeth Warren got in trouble. If she had as much Native American DNA as she has and was growing up on a reservation, were somehow associated with Native American culture, they would have welcomed her as a sister. It's true. But she wasn't. She has no more Native American DNA than millions of other Americans. And we wouldn't call them Native American, but if they grew up on a reservation, we would call them Native American, even if they don't look Native American. Because it's cultural. And we have to be sensitive to this, and there's a lot of anger about this. Kennewick man. He was discovered up here somewhere. I don't know where's Kennewick? How far away? Do you know what state it's in? Close by? All right, compared to me in Atlanta, it's like next door. So they found this guy called Kennewick man. They claimed he's 8,000 years old. Found him in 1996. And the natives in the area said, wait a minute, that's our ancestor. How dare you desecrate it? Give it back. Well, the geneticists are saying, they said, we'll give it back if he's Native American, because he didn't look Native American, he looked European. And so they did some genetic work, and what do you know? He's extremely Native American. So they gave back the bones, and they reburied them in 2015. So now he's rotting in the ground. Is that good or bad? It's culture. However, there was a nice trade-off, a very nice trade-off. The geneticists got the DNA, the Native Americans got the bones back. So he's not lost to science, and I think that was a nice compromise, because it would never have been resolved otherwise. Okay, let's hop the Pacific Pond and go over to East Asia. The oldest DNA we found in East Asia is from a cave near Beijing. They say it's 40,000 years old. Now, interestingly, it looks very much like modern Chinese people. Cool. The modern Chinese people have been in place for a very, very long time. In fact, I think right after the flood, they landed there and they stayed put, and their population has just been growing ever since. But the Native Americans have variants that this guy didn't have. And this guy's very closely related to the modern Chinese people. Therefore, he was living after the Native Americans and the Chinese people split. That's cool. You can tell all these neat historical things with ancient DNA. It's really fascinating. Okay, let's keep going west. Let's go to Europe. Now, granted, I don't think necessarily Europe is founded by Japhethites. One reason that the earliest people in Europe are the Neanderthals, and they branch off from current African branches. Oh, that might be Ham. Second, the earliest Europeans didn't have white skin. According to the DNA, we can look at DNA today and say, oh, all these people have dark skin, all these people have that variant of that gene, and all these people have light skin, they have a different variant of that gene. Oh, this gene causes light skin or dark skin depending on what variant you have. Well, the ancient Europeans carried variants for dark skin, but a lot of them had blue eyes. Well, maybe. See, 23andMe.com says I'm supposed to have blue eyes. I have 3 blue-eyed children, but I have brown eyes. So it's not, even though we have DNA, it's no guarantee that we're actually calling the colors correctly. Especially since there's so many things that influence hair color, skin color, and eye color. And these guys have a lot of variants we don't have today. We're not really sure what they look like, but it's a pretty good guess. And the weird thing about Europe is that there's multiple occupational layers in Europe. You got Neanderthals, you got the ancient hunter-gatherers, the Western hunter-gatherers, you got the Neolithic farmers, and then you got... none of those layers, by the way, have European DNA. Unlike the Chinese, the Europeans are somewhere else in history. I'll tell you where in a minute. This is cool. This came out in December. That black thing there, that's not feces. That's a chewed up piece of birch resin found in Denmark from the Neolithic. And they had bite marks in it. Oh, someone chewed this. And they pulled out human DNA. It was a female. She had dark skin and blue eyes, and her last meal was hazelnuts and duck. Because as she was chewing, it was getting mashed in. This is so cool. She was also sensitive to lactose, and she also carried the Epstein-Barr virus. And she was related to the Western hunter-gatherers. And what's a hunter-gatherer? It's a person who doesn't have a farm. Think of someone living in a cabin in the North Woods. They're not farmers, right? They go out hunting bears and pick berries in the springtime. They're hunter-gatherers. Native Americans, it's hard. Native Americans have very complex societies, and then 90% of them died from smallpox and things like that after the Europeans discovered them. So by the time we notice what Native Americans are like, most of them are hunter-gatherers because their societies had collapsed. Okay? But she's not related to the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. She's related, even though she's in Scandinavia, she's related to the people from down in Spain and France. Oh, this is so cool. The oldest modern humans we find in Europe that are not Neanderthals are actually the predecessors to Neanderthals. Neanderthals didn't look like Neanderthals until the end of the Neanderthals. The earliest Neanderthals, we called them Homo heidelbergensis. Looks like modern man. A little different, but very modern man-like. So they had these bones they found in a cave in Spain, the Cima de las Suezas cave. Supposedly 430,000 years old. And they pulled DNA out of them, and clearly they're the predecessors of the Neanderthals. They found 51 other skeletons in a different place. These are early modern humans. They don't look like Neanderthals. They look like modern humans. But they left no trace in the modern human gene pool. So this entire cultural group, all their memories are lost. All their songs, all their stories, all their houses have fallen into ruin. All the artifacts have just disintegrated. There's no memory of these people, and there's no DNA of these people. That's sad. But I'm expecting we're going to find that all over the world in different places. They found another bone in it's in Romania, OASE, OASE number 1. They found a skeleton who had a Neanderthal ancestor maybe 6 generations prior. Cool. But those Neanderthal variants are not found in the modern human population. So modern humans and Neanderthals must have interbred on more than one occasion. In fact, a lot of different occasions. Why? Because they're people too. And you know what happens when people meet. So let me give you a rough sketch of Europe using evolutionary numbers. Before 40,000 years ago, we had Neanderthals. 40,000 years ago, we have non-Europeans living in Europe. About 35,000 years ago, we have the Western hunter-gatherers. Now, by the way, the Neanderthals left some DNA in the next level, and they left some DNA in the next level, because as new people came in, and DNA gets left behind. Now, this actually answers a long-standing argument in European archaeology. Did the Europeans, were they stay put, and did they just change their culture, and then change their culture, and it's the same people, or did new people move in from the outside? And the answer is, new people moved in from the outside. Because maybe about 9,000 in evolutionary years ago, that should be EYA, I like that, evolutionary years ago. I coined that, that's mine. About 9,000 EYA, we have the Neolithic. You know, Neolithic? New stone? This is the early European farmers, and farmers bring their food, and they have a high technology, it's called the cow. Change the face of Europe and increase the population dramatically. And they came from the southeast, from Anatolia, that's Turkey, or maybe even Mesopotamia. So after the flood, the first people who dispersed didn't adopt very good technology. Well, they were struggling, small people in far-flung areas of the world, and the people who plodded along after them brought farms with them and had a lot more people, and they overwhelmed the first people. We see that in different places in the world. They also brought with them the SLC24A5 gene, which the other people had, but they brought a particular variant of this gene that anyone in this room with European ancestry has 2 identical copies of. And it is the gene on the end of chromosome 16 that produces this color. 2 identical copies? That means your mother and your father are both related to that person. We're all inbred. Very inbred to do that. Have you ever heard of Otzi, the Tyrolean Iceman? Now, I don't want to show a picture of him because it's a mummified, shriveled up man. So some people don't like it, so I'm not going to show you. But they found, as his glaciers melting back and on the border between Italy and Switzerland, someone found a guy. I'm like, how old is this guy? Leather clothing. He had grass stuffed in his boots, insulation. He had a pouch with ash in it. He was carrying around embers with him so he could start his fire. He had another pouch with mushrooms in him. No, not shrooms. These mushrooms contain something that's a remedy for pinworms. He had a pinworm infection. Ugh. So did most people back then. Everyone carried parasites. Oh well, sorry to be gross, but it's true. When they found King Richard III, the last of the Plantagenets, He got killed in battle, and he was actually buried. The abbey that they buried him in burned down and put a parking lot there. And so they took the parking lot apart, and they found King Richard III. He had a horrible case of scoliosis, just like Shakespeare said. And as they're looking in the dirt near his stomach, they found eggs from parasites that he got from eating probably cow. Those little things that hatch in your liver and swim up and they go into your lungs, and you swallow them and they go out in your poop and they get someone else infected. Yeah, that stuff. Oh. Anyway, he had stuff like that too. Oh, and he had been shot in the back with an arrow. That's what killed him. He had tattoos. His arrows were fletched so that they'd in flight, and they were on two parts and two pieces of wood. So if he shot something, he at least wouldn't lose the back end of the arrow with the feathers on it. And this guy's brilliant. Anyway, his DNA fits the early European farmers and is a high match for a lot of people who live in the highlands of Sardinia today. Sardinia is an island to the west of Italy. These are some of the longest lived people on earth. More people live to more than 100 years in Sardinia than almost anywhere in the world. Now, there's a cluster of them in Loma Linda. Bunch of little old ladies who are Seventh-day Adventists who have been vegetarians all their life. Yeah, there's a whole lot of them, and they're over 100 years old. There's an island in Japan. There's an island in Greece and Sardinia. And Otzi is related to Sardinians. Now, if they lived so long, I wonder if they might carry some genes that were, dispersing from Babel. Maybe some of the patriarchal genes that help people live a long time were there. I don't know. I'm just fascinated by this. Okay, now let's talk about where the Europeans came from. In the evolutionary terminology, about 5,000 years old. Bronze Age. Abraham. During the Bronze Age, there were migrations from the Asian steppe. What's that? That's the vast grasslands that the Mongols used to cross from Mongolia all the way across Asia until they were knocking on the doors of Vienna. The steppe. These people had ancient Near Eastern ancestry. Ancient Near East, Mesopotamia, Israel. That's the Near East, so the ancient Near East. They also had Indo-European languages. Oh, that's our languages. They brought, apparently, the corded ware culture. They're making pots, and they wrap them with a braided cord, and they make patterns on the outside of the pot. I don't know why. That's just the way they made their pots then. And this is very similar to the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic steppe. What's the Pontic steppe? That's the Pontic steppe. Welcome to the source environment of modern Europeans. When they find a kurgan, you know what a kurgan is? It's a grass mound somewhere out here, and you go in the grass mound, they dig into it, and they find like a dead horse and a chieftain and a sword. And if you look at his DNA, he has European DNA. You see, the Europeans were here. The Pontus is between the area between the Black and the Caspian Seas. They were in this grassland, and then they exploded. They went east, they went west, they went south, they went all the way to India. In fact, in the Hindu caste system, the higher caste you are, the more likely you have Indo-European DNA. The lower caste you are, the more likely you have Southeast Asian DNA. The invaders imposed a false religion in that population to enslave them and put themselves at the top. Crazy. Now, this thing I showed you earlier about my Y chromosome, that map I showed you, and some people appeared in Africa. So this map is incomplete because they got all the way down to here, and they got up to here. My Y chromosome comes from there, and my Y chromosome started there. Here's a map, family tree of all the Y chromosome families in the world. I made this. This took me a long time. Where am I? I'm right here, along with 80% of European males. This other group right above it, this is like India, Pakistan. Oh, they also came from the steppes. Q, Native Americans. But can you see how all these people have short branches and they come to this point right there? That's their common ancestor. We know what Y chromosome he carried. He might have even been a biblical patriarch. But he's right there. That's interesting. Oh, by the way, O, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. You see this pattern? You see this fan pattern? That is a signal of a population that's been in place for a very long time. They've just been expanding and expanding and expanding. This is a signal of a population that was very small and exploded. Also here, you see this one? The same pattern here. It's like a broomstick with a bunch of bristles. These are 95% of modern African males belong to this group. But these are not Africans. These, again, Pakistan, India, Crete, Bulgaria. Genghis Khan was a C. So here we have Africans branching off from non-Africans, and they branch off from non-Africans, and they branch off from non-Africans. These did not arise in Africa. Have you ever heard someone say, oh, we're all Africans? Well, that's funny because 95% of the Africans aren't African. They invaded after the fact and took over. Slatkin and Racimo, 2006, Ancient DNA and Human History. They said this: we now know that present-day populations were created by a complex history of admixture and population movement. Although local genetic continuity over long periods has been documented in a few cases, these are exceptional. The general rule is that the ancestors of present-day population lived somewhere else. I forgot to tell you about Cheddar Man. You know, cheddar cheese comes from Cheddar, England. And they found a guy in a cave, called him Cheddar Man. And they looked at the mitochondria, and there's some people living there today that have the same mitochondria. One of the local school teachers, descended from Cheddar Man, but he's Neolithic. Way long time ago. And he probably had dark skin and blue eyes. Again. We can also apply this to Africa. I'm going to very briefly talk about Africa. This chart makes me very uncomfortable. This is collected by ethnologists prior to World War II, and essentially every ethnologist prior to World War II was an abject racist. I'm happy we have moved beyond this, but because Charles Darwin basically put Europeans at the top of the evolutionary ladder and black people at the bottom, and they were Darwinists, that's history. But data should be data, and this is people going around with a chromatic scale on a card and going up to people and looking at places on their body where they don't get sunlight and saying, what color is their skin? And they made this map. But the interesting thing is, these people, the Khoisan Bushmen that live in the Kalahari Desert, they're not, pardon the phrase, black. Why do I say pardon the phrase? Because nobody's black and nobody's white. We're different shades of tan. You know that, right? Okay. These people are actually the color of Barack Obama, whose mother was European. Oh. And the genes here for skin color are the same as the genes for skin color here. Oh. And then when you look at Africa, there's a lot of dark-skinned people in Africa, but also in southern India, in Melanesia, Australia. The cool thing is, we just figured this out like 2 years ago. The same exact genetic variants that cause dark skin here, 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 and here, and here, also cause it here. Meaning, the dark-skinned genes are already in the population before we spread out. The light-skinned genes are already in our population before we spread out. We don't need evolution to explain the origin of skin colors. They're already there in the earliest population, which should be Babel. But here's where ancient DNA comes in. Africa is a lousy place to preserve DNA because that's the equator. It's very warm in Africa. But they have found a couple of caves and some highland elevations, some rock shelters and places like that, where they've been able to pull out some bones, look in the petrous bone, and they found some DNA in some of these things. But the DNA of this region doesn't match the people living there today. It matches the people living down here. Have you heard of the Zulu Wars in Africa? Right, the Dutch, when they got to South Africa, they found a 100-mile wide swath of open land. And they said, woohoo, free land! The Zulus had killed off everyone within 100 miles of their homeland, and the Dutch walked right into it. And then the English inherited this problem, and we have the Zulu Wars. Essentially, the Zulus are right there. Sorry, I can't hold my camera. I do it here. The Zulus are right here. They're a Bantu-speaking people. They're the end of the Bantu expansion. The Bantus come from here. And maybe 1,500 years ago, they started expanding, and they brought farms and cows with them. And because of their superior numbers, they crowded out and killed off all the people that used to live here. So if you went to Africa 2,000 years ago, it wouldn't be as dark as it is today. Just like if you went to Europe 3,000 years ago, it wouldn't be as light as it is today. Why? Because your ancestors killed other people. That's why you're alive. They killed people and took their stuff and took their land. You just look at ancient history. It is bloody. In fact, that's why there aren't more than 7 billion people in the world. They estimated that if World War I and II hadn't happened, Europe would have as much people as China has today. 1.3 billion people. But the Europeans killed themselves off. Again. And again. And again. Anyway. We can also talk about Neanderthal, ancient DNA. The Neanderthals, when they first pulled DNA out, they looked at the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are not found in modern people. And they said, oh, Neanderthals aren't people. And then in 2007, they come up with a 1.3 times coverage map, 60% complete. They say, whoops, Neanderthals are people. In fact, modern people are about 3% Neanderthal. And it happened more than once, as I said earlier. Okay. They found another completely different group of people in this cave in eastern Russia. Denisova cave. Funny, Neanderthals are named after Joachim, I can't pronounce his name, Joic, however you say that. Joachim Neander, the hymn writer. Denisovans are named after Saint Denis of the Orthodox Church who lived in that cave. It's funny, the two main people groups we know of are named after Christians in a funny way. Anyway, we didn't actually have a skeleton of these guys. We found a finger bone in a cave, and the finger bone happened to have DNA, so they sequenced it, and they found a brand new group. It's as different from modern people as Neanderthals are. They're a little bit more closely related to Neanderthals, but only a little. And we don't, now, so I keep saying we, I don't mean to say it. Europeans don't carry Denisovan DNA, but Asians do. Up to 0.5%. And some people in Melanesia, that's the islands in the southern and southeastern Pacific, they're up to 7% Denisovan and 3% Neanderthal. Up to 10% of those people's genomes is not modern European. But they're as perfectly intelligent as anybody else. They're just as advanced as everybody else. They're lovely, nice people. You would never know that they have a lot of ancient DNA in them. In fact, DNA from people that didn't turn into Homo sapiens in Africa, they're 10% non-human, or they're 100% human, and Denisovans and Neanderthals are human. I like that much better. There's some high altitude adaptation in people in Tibet. We found that variant in Denisovans, as if the Tibetans got the ability to live at high altitude without getting altitude sickness like you and I probably would from then. They also found a girl in this cave. Her, if I get it right, her mother was a Denisovan, her father was a Neanderthal. Now I said there's probably intermarrying between these groups, but given vast periods of time and multiple intermarryings, what's the probability you're going to find that person? Like almost nothing, unless there wasn't a vast amount of time. And then the probability to find the person is much greater. But the weird thing is, the Neanderthal part was not related to the Neanderthal buried 3 feet away. It was related to the Neanderthals found in Croatia. If we look at Neanderthals, we can study their DNA, we can estimate how large their population was. Some people say maybe 5,000 Neanderthals spread over 3,000 miles. If you started walking from Croatia and you started going east, what's the probability you're going to end up at Denisova Cave? I'd say 0. And yet the fact that that's there and so clearly related to these people means they had an interacting network. They knew where each other was. And they were trading and migrating. Oh, that's weird. All right, let me give you the take-home points. 1, despite all probability, ancient DNA exists. 2, it tells us a lot about ancient history. A lot. 3, it does not contradict the Bible as long as you understand the context of the Table of Nations. We have to be careful. You can't say Japheth went to Europe. It doesn't work that way. Also, the Bible doesn't say that. Now, the time frame is directly contradicted by the very presence of the DNA. Because I can appeal to laboratory measurements, science that is, and say, this is how long DNA lasts before it's gone. These things can't be that old. The evolutionists have to appeal to unknown mechanisms of DNA preservation. I'm comfortable with that. I'm very happy about that. Now, do expect curveballs to appear. This is a brand new field. We don't have hardly any ancient DNA from Asia, Siberia, or Africa. And when those things start coming up, we're going to have to change our stories again. But it does look like, at least for Europe, where most of the DNA has come from, most of the studies are done because, all this DNA research is done by Europeans, so therefore we got more data for Europe. That's just the way it is. And it does look like they figured out the sequence of events that it involves invasion, invasion, invasion. By the way, the Mongols were the last invasion, and it failed. The only reason it failed was because the Khan died. And the brothers had to go back and elect a new Khan, and they started fighting. If the Khan hadn't died, they had a 5-year plan for taking over Europe, and they were ahead. And there was no European army that could possibly have stopped them. And that's why we look like we look and we don't speak Mongolian. Because they lost. So many more fun anecdotes. I love this intersection of history and science. And I love the fact that the Bible is fitting in here. But there's a lot more subject to turn to, and you might want to say, okay, Carter, what else? Where do I go for more information? Well, first, read your Bibles. That's going to answer most of your questions. Just read it. Second, take a look at creation.com. Tons and tons of articles there. Read to you forever. You're not going to run out of our 14,000 articles. Third, pick up a book on your way out. I mean, my purpose here isn't to sell you books. My purpose is to encourage you and maybe point you to some good resources. If you're going to ask me for recommendation, I just tell people get Creation Magazine. As a scientist, I still learn things in Creation Magazine. Even though one editor sits next to me and one of the editors in the office next door and they talk all the time, I still learn things in Creation Magazine. It's been a huge blessing to me. I started subscribing to this when I was a sophomore in college in 1990. I think this is a tool that God used to keep me in Christianity. And now here we are, 30 years later, I'm a CMI speaker, and I can't believe I get to work for these people. If you'd like to get Creation Magazine, we have a sign-up form. We're going to pass around here as we wrap up. There's 2 options, 1 year or 2 year. If you do sign up for it here, we're going to give you your first copy of the magazine, which is on the table. We're also going to sign you up for our digital magazine, which is really cool because you can share it with other people. We'll also sign you up for our monthly mailings or prayer news update or science updates. Oh, and you know how those infomercials always say, but wait, there's more. Yeah, of course there's more. For a 2-year subscription, we're going to give you 2 presents. We're going to give you a copy of something that cost us nearly $1 million. A 1-hour National Geographic-style documentary on the life of Charles Darwin. Darwin, the voyage that shook the world. If you understand evolution, you got to understand that guy's life, and he's a fascinating person. We're also going to include a copy of something we call Fallout. This is a 35-minute mini documentary we made by taking a TV camera to college campuses. And you know what questions we asked the students? A couple hundred students. Did you go to church growing up? Were you ever taught anything about creation and evolution? And do you still go to church? And wow, that made some very, very interesting conversations. All right, those guys are doing that now. They're doing a great job. Johnny on the spot. Thank you, sirs. And pass all this, pass all this, pass all that. Okay. If you're new to creation, and many of you are not, but if there is someone here who's new to creation, let me also recommend the Creation Answers book. That answers 99% of the questions we get. That's why we wrote that book. It's the top 60 questions. I can also recommend the starter pack, which comes with the Answers book, then the #1 best-selling creation and evolution book ever written, Refuting Evolution by Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. And it comes with a DVD. Speaking of DVDs and genetics, this is actually there's only 1 copy on the table left, but if you would like to get one, we will ship it to you for free Just tell me, I'll write your name down when everything, and we'll get it to you. But mitochondrial even of 3 daughters of Noah is me trying to explain the human genome has, say it this way, me trying to explain that Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, and the Tower of Babel are in the human genome, and the evolutionists discovered it for us. The high-tech cell is me trying to explain how the human genome works, but no one understands how the human genome works because it's too complicated. Evolution's Achilles' heels is us asking PhD Bible-believing scientists what evolution cannot answer. Oh, that was powerful. Genetic entropy was written by my dear friend Dr. John Sanford, who invented the gene gun. You ever heard of genetically modified organisms, GMOs? Yeah, he invented them. He was trying to feed the world by making plants better. And then he became a Christian. And then to the horror of his colleagues, he became a creationist and wrote this insider's guide to evolutionary theory. There's not any math in here. There's some really cool concepts. And he's got quote after quote from famous evolutionists. Basically, they all know that the game is up, but they won't admit it in public. And I'm going to leave you with 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the hope that is in you. You do it with gentleness and respect. I tried real hard to be respectful to people that hate me. But we're called to do it. And you know what? If you're a jerk, you're probably not pointing people toward the kingdom. But we can stand confidently and competently on the Word of God and actually use science to support our position. But we have to learn a lot to be able to do it. I think you just learned a whole lot. All right. Thank you all very much. What time it is?
Thank you, Rob. So we're going to take about 10 minutes for Q&A.
Yes, okay.
So think of some questions you might want to ask that he didn't cover or you want to get some more details on. And one of the ways we support this ministry is we do take a free will offering for those that would like to help us support and cover bringing in speakers like this. The men will come around in a few minutes, and feel free to contribute. We are a tax-free organization if that matters to you. And you can also, there's donation boxes. If you'd rather do it there, that's fine too. So if you have a question, put up your hand, and I will bring the mic around.
Can I do my standard before the questions caveats? Please make sure it's a question. Questions end in question marks. No soapboxes, no long stories, no prophecies. Over the years, I've heard a lot of things. I've developed this set of rules. Please don't ask me anything about doctrine that might divide this congregation, and nothing where I might be tempted to contradict what might be preached from this podium. That would not be fair of me. I don't know what the doctrinal positions of the church are, and I don't want to get there. So if you ask me that question, hopefully the pastor is here, and now he's got a sermon topic for next Sunday, and you have to come next Sunday. Okay? All right. If we can handle that, go.
Okay. Two things. What book of yours has this information? And second, with the giants of Sardinia, do you know?
The giants of Sardinia or the long-lived people of Sardinia?
No, giants, I guess they have.
Okay, first, what book of mine contains this? It's the book that's on my laptop. I've written 5 chapters. And John Sanford is my co-author, and we're meeting on March the 17th, 18th, and 19th to hash out some details that we're dealing with, but it's coming. I've been promising people that for like 10 years, but it really is. I got 5 chapters written. And part of the study for this is because I need to add this to the book. I have not heard of the giants of Sardinia. I've heard a lot of claims of giants, and I don't believe most of them. Most of this is driven by people who think that Genesis chapter 6 is talking about giants, but the word is not giant in Hebrew. It's Nephilim, means fallen ones. It is translated giant in the King James. It's actually transliterated from the Latin. The Latin has gigantes. And the gigantes in Latin and Greek mythology are the half-god, half-hybrid, half-man hybrids. Like, who's a strong guy? Hercules. So it's actually a reference to inbreeding between gods and humans, which is the other viewpoint for a lot of people, that there's actually angels that were interbreeding with human females. I don't want to go there. The book out there, Alien Intrusion, has the best summary of all the 4 classic views that I'm aware of. Does a great job on it.
Another question here.
Sir.
What about the genetics of Jewishness?
Oh, the genetics of Jewishness. Excellent question. I happen to have just written a 2-part article on Journal of Creation. I think the first part's available on creation.com now. And I call it the genetic history of the Israelite nation. The first part, I went through Scripture. And I looked through every example I could find of a Jewish person that married a non-Jewish person. I could name a couple, and I found hundreds. There should be no genetic distinction between the Jewish people and the people around them, according to their own history. I mean, Absalom was half not Jewish. So was Tamar. David, his grandmother wasn't Jewish. His great-great-grandmother wasn't Jewish. One of Judah's sons, Judah, the prostitute on the road, that story, well, his other son that she didn't get married to became a chieftain in Israel later on. One of David's relations had an Egyptian servant, and he didn't have any sons, so he let his Egyptian servant marry one of his daughters. There's hundreds of examples in Scripture of Jewish people marrying non-Jewish people, so they should not be distinct from the people around them. And then the second paper actually looked at the genetics, and it backs this up.
Okay, next question.
But they are different, especially the Ashkenazi Jews in Eastern Europe, because they kept marrying amongst themselves. Well, it's the same thing that happened to Irish people. They're genetically different from the English people because they didn't like the English people. But they're not that different. Okay, sir.
Rob, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Talking early on, when I listen to these kinds of things, I can't help but remember Mike Biddle, the 3 questions they always ask. Are you making any assumptions? At first, you said, if I understood you correctly, and if not, please tie this together for me.
Okay.
You take the ancient DNA, doesn't come in strands, you have to cut the ends off,
Yep.
you then try to stack them up and match them and all of that. And I think somewhere in there you said, so we assume that this is what it is.
Yeah.
So all of this, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's not observable because it happened in the past.
Yes and no.
Making assumptions that all of these things that you say are going around the world, the eye color, the skin color, and all of these things, they're not proof. They're evidence toward strong assumptions.
There's strong evidences to an assumption. The assumption is that the DNA today should reflect the DNA in the past. That gene should do the same thing. Like we found this gene for sickle cell anemia in an ancient person. You probably have sickle cell anemia. The first Neanderthal genome was really speculative. But then when they did a dozen more and got the same exact letter variants, they replicated the experiment many times and got the same answer. So it really does look like it's really solid data. This really is the genetics of a Neanderthal. And it's because there's so many more. I remember what the second part was. Okay, sir.
Cro-Magnon man.
Cro-Magnon.
When I was growing up,
That's right.
he was more robust, his skull was larger and all that stuff. Does that exist anymore?
The Cro-Magnon, that's called modern human. Yeah, a lot of the ancient terminology we cannot no longer use Caucasian, Mongoloid, and Negroid. Those terms have no applicability in the world at all. It was ridiculous that they even used them. They never worked. I mean, have you ever seen an East African person? They look like a European with dark skin. So what do you call them? They're not Mongoloid. They're not Negroid. Okay, so forget those terms. Those terms are very racist, and we don't use them anymore. And plus, between Europe and Africa, there's a grade. Between Europe and Asia, there's a grade. There's not a whoosh, There's the line. And it's a grade because people exchange genes. Going back one question, there's also the hypothesis that the Jewish people came from the Khazar people of basically the Western grasslands in Asia, and they converted to Judaism hundreds of years ago. It's actually not true genetically. There might have been a conversion to the Khazar Empire, fine, but the Jewish people are not related to them. They're actually related. They go back to the Middle East, even if they've intermarried with Europeans a lot. I wrote about that in my article, by the way.
Okay, next question.
Sir.
Could you give a 30-second synopsis of the genetic/migration path for South America?
Yeah, sure. In fact, it's really kind of cool. When Native Americans got to North America, they went straight down the coast. And especially because the environment here is pretty much the same as the environment down like San Diego, they just follow the kelp highway. The abalone, the kelp, the meat, the fish, they just, and it happened fast. Even using a carbon dating thing, it happened quickly. And then once they're there, they just went right into South America. And there's the Eskimos are now called the Inuit. Thank you. The Inuit population is a later migration that came across and actually looks like it replaced the first Inuit-like people that were there. And so there's always been this ebb and flow, but it looks like the Native Americans only got here once.
Can you relate briefly how this connects with Shem, Ham, and Japheth?
Sure. How does this connect with Shem, Ham, and Japheth? Shem, Ham, and Japheth were the ancestors of the modern population. Them and their 3 wives gave rise to everyone on earth today. But at first, the population was in one place. And they're marrying and giving in marriage and having more and more children and growing. And then at Babel, no, I'm not exactly certain how long after the flood this was. It could have been 100 years after the flood, which means there wasn't millions of people. Or it could have been a couple hundred years later. The people spread out. When they spread out, they got isolated from one another. Isolation is what produces the racial characteristics. Because first of all, you don't have all the genetics of that initial population. You only have some of the genetics. And then when everyone's marrying their cousin or their sister, that inbreeding makes genes get lost. And so pretty quickly they would have started looking different. And that's where the races come from. And then as they grew and grew, they started interacting with one another, and that's where we get these grades as the genes flow across the landscape. But Shem, Ham, and Japheth just there really early. Come tomorrow, and I'm going to show the Y chromosome tree and the mitochondrial tree, and I'm going to talk about where all these people belong in the world in much more detail than I did now.
One more question.
Thank you for your talk.
You're welcome.
I just read a book on ancient post-flood history, and they were saying that the Jewish calendar dates creation at 5780, and you're saying it's at 4,000. So I'm wondering where you got your numbers.
The Jewish calendar is different. I'm not exactly certain where they get it. I suspect they get it from the Septuagint Greek translation of the Old Testament, which gives us 1,600 extra years. Because you know in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, like Genesis 5, Adam was 130 years when he had Seth. Adam lived for another 800 years. His total lifespan was 930 years. That's the formula. And it says that 10 people in a row till you get to Noah. Well, the Septuagint takes 100 out of this column and adds 100 to this column. So Adam is 230 years old. He lives for another 700 years, and the total is still 930. So some of the Septuagint advocates advocate that, no, Septuagint is original, the Masoretic switched the numbers around. But all the data is indicating that the Masoretic is holding a more original reading, and someone, who knows why, they took 100 out of this column and added to that column. And it's true in Genesis 11 also. It's one of those scholarly puzzles that the scholars can argue about like crazy, but it does add 1,600 years to the history of the earth. Because every patriarch's about 100 years older when the child is born. I'm guessing that's where they get it. I'm not certain, though. But I'm fascinated by calendars, and I want to know that one. Just it's one of those hanging chads I've never gotten around to digging into.
Okay, one last
question. Okay, excellent question.
Yeah, there's about 26 tribal groups in Guatemala, and one of them, a major group called Kekchi. Every once in a while, they'll get together, and one's got the right genes and the other one, and they put out a child that looks like a full-blooded Chinaman.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, and one of the reasons why we have the Asian-like features appearing in Central and South America is because they derive from Asian peoples. There's also some speculation that the Chinese discovered South America in 1621, before Columbus. There's no actual evidence for that, but we know that they were sending out massive sailing fleets, and the central ship was the size of Noah's Ark, and a bunch of support vessels. They made it at least as far as Madagascar. They probably discovered Australia. They went all over the Philippines and the South Pacific Islands. Some people say they discovered South America from this side, because there's the chicken, there's these funny lacquered boxes that some of the South American people make. They're just like Chinese lacquered boxes and things like that. But the genetics isn't there. And when sailors find villages, you know what sailors are like, there would be some exchange of DNA. But the evidence isn't there. It might be found one day, but they haven't found it yet. Anyway,
okay.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you, Rob, for
You're welcome.
Presentation and answering these questions. And there's a lot more to come. Like you said, it's a new field.
Yeah.
So we'll look forward to having you later.
Thank you.
So I want to remind you, next month we have another creationist. This is Dr. Keith Svensson from Portland. He's an expert on Mount St. Helens. He's got a degree in geology, so he's well qualified to talk on that. He's done a lot of tours in that area. So he'll be here on Friday, March the 27th, and talking on that topic. And remember, this is the year, the 40th anniversary of the eruption on Mount St. Helens. So it's going to be very timely as well. So just to remind you, on the back table, there's flyers covering all the things that are coming up. And particularly, I want to pay you to pay attention again to tomorrow. Dr. Carter is going to follow up on his talk this evening and give a lot more detail on how this all fits together and what DNA is telling us and what DNA tells us about Adam and Eve. That's really the focus of the two lectures he's going to give in Mount Vernon tomorrow morning. And then tomorrow evening, we're going to have a youth night out here. It's going to be in this church, and that starts at 6 o'clock. I know there are some people from different churches coming. If you have not let us know yet if your church is going to be having some people come, do let us know. And because we want to have a good count beforehand, we're going to have pizza at 6 in the evening. And so it helps to know roughly how many people are going to be here. And so that'll go from 6 o'clock to about 8 o'clock tomorrow evening here. So look at the flyers in the back, and hope that to see some of you there. Parents are also welcome, so you know what your children are asking questions about. So again, there's a lot of resources in the back on the two tables there. Take a look at those, and there's refreshments, coffee, tea, and other things in the back. So again, thank you for coming. Let me just close in a word of prayer, and you'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for Dr. Carter and the knowledge that he has shared with us. We just, again, thank you that you have left so much evidence for us from the truth of your word. And we just pray that others would learn from this as well and be able to share what they've learned and go forth from there. Give each person traveling mercies back home. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.